Welcome to Little Cities Week. We have not let the COVID crisis keep us down, and as October approaches, our annual Little Cities of Black Diamonds Day date shows up on the calendar. But because of COVID, we've decided this year to go online and do a virtual Little Cities Week instead of day, and it's a Little Cities Fest, we're calling it. Our theme for the Little Cities of Black Diamonds this year is Roaring into the 20s, looking at the 1920s in the Little Cities of Black Diamonds region and in the greater world. And there are great stories to be told about that era here in southeastern Ohio as well as across the country. Tune in every evening this week at 7 p.m. for really engaging programs, and we'd really enjoy your support of our sponsors who will show up in these programs, as well as your contributions at www.lcbdohio.org. Thank you and enjoy the show.
This is a really important place in the history of this region, but before we get to the history of the cave, what we wanted to first discuss about the history of, I guess, coal mining and why coal mining began here. Okay, well, I guess we'd have to say that the end of the Civil War freed up money for capital. And there was the Industrial Revolution was taking off, and there was a large need for coal. And one thing they've always known here is that there was a lot of coal under the hills. That's the earliest surveys in the 1700s show it. So, and what they had discovered was that the coal here is an incredibly big one. It's 12 to 14 feet. Wow. A common size vein of coal can be 5 or 6 feet, and there are some that are only 2 or 3. So definitely, if you're going to start bringing in coal and not have as much investment dollars, the Hocking Valley was where you wanted to go. So as soon as the Civil War was over, the companies started bringing in the railroads to start bringing out coal. So the two arrived really at the same time and are the same investors. New Straitsviile was the first of the total coal mining boom towns in the Hocking Valley. There were other towns that had existed that were turned over to the coal, but this one started and was built where there was nothing here but a farmhouse or two. So, and that's really started with a time period that I call a sort of a crossroads. 1869 was the year that John D. Martin from Lancaster came and bought up the coal mining lands around New Straitsviile and started booming a town, you know, and notifying people that there were sites available to put businesses. At the same time, a man named Christopher Evans moved to the United States from Great Britain. The towns here are filling up with British Isle people who were getting out. So that's part of the story as well. Now, another story is that because of the huge influx of people, new ideas are arriving, the ideas about the labor struggle. And in Pennsylvania, they started an organization called the Knights of Labor. And they believed that cooperation could get you a lot further than strikes, that you needed to all work together. They believed that labor is the first capital, and they said that is the most perfect government in which an injury to one is the concern of all. And I can tell you a little bit more about that, but the fact is you had to be a good person to join. You had to be asked to join. You had to do, it was top secret. And so you had to carry tokens or give a signal that you were a member. Wow. And because they expected you to be a good person, by the 1880s they were accepting black people and women, but you couldn't join if you were a bartender, prostitute, banker, or a lawyer. Of course. So, okay, so we've got a town full of energetic people who came to this country to make a difference, to have their voices heard. They're now settling in the Hocking Valley, and New Straitsviile became a center. One, it was where a lot of people were going to get work. If you wanted to work and standing up rather than bend over in a mine, this was a good place to go.
Like I said, it was a new opportunity. There were a lot of advertisements for workers here that were on the East Coast, so you came here to work. When Mr. Evans visited here, he saw that this was an area ripe for organizing and it would be a good place to move. So he moved to Ohio in 1877, and within a few years, he moved right here. And within a few years, he'd helped found the Ohio Miners Amalgamated by partnering up with miners from the Tuscarawas Valley. In 1884, one of the coal companies had basically merged in with a lot of the others. And so instead of having one or two local owners who knew their men, you had a lot of outside ownership. And those people started deciding that the easiest thing to do if you want to increase profits, cut the pay of the workers. So they told the men that they wanted them to take about 20 cents down on what they'd been making. And these guys said, we can't live on that. And they went on strike in the middle of the summer of 1884. They kept, Christopher Evans wound up being put in charge of the strike, trying to negotiate, to try to get the state involved in arbitration. There were all these things going on, but by fall, things were getting pretty bad. The men were running out of money, their gardens were drying up, their kids had to start school. And even with the union saying that we need to stay legal, keep it calm, and let's get more people involved here, get the state to say enough's enough, some of the men went out and set the mines on fire. 9 different locations over a 4-month period, from September of 84 to January of 85. And those fires continued to burn. Some of them still burn to this day. So there's an underground story, but the story behind it is actually even more important, because the changes that came about during this strike, and somehow they formed a National Federation of Miners, headquarters New Straitsviile, meeting right here at this cave. Then at the same time, Evans had helped found the Knights of Labor locals here. And the oldest 2 Knights of Labor locals for coal mining in Ohio were New Straitsviile and Shawnee. They had started to merge, and they had formed a district assembly, which the headquarters also was listed as New Straitsviile. And many of the labor leaders were strictly from this area. So now you've got the 2 most powerful groups in the labor struggle for coal mining in the same town. And they had gotten the arbitration they were looking for. They had gotten the state involved. They'd even gotten a joint conference system. The Federation had gotten a joint conference system to get the coal operators to sit down with the miners and set the price of coal for each year, which would make a lot less strikes. Most strikes were about money. The first union was the National Federation of Miners and Mine Laborers. 6 months later, the Knights of Labor put together a trade assembly, but they weren't allowed to use the word trades. And then, and finally, in 1889, in the fall, the death of a miner here got the 2 groups to talking again. And this man died in the mines because there weren't enough people there to help, because the Knights of Labor men wouldn't talk to the National Progressive Union men. And so when they brought that man's body out the next day, the guys supposedly met, and someone said, for God's sakes, boys, we have to stop this rivalry that cost a man's life. And they came up here and met and decided to try again to merge. They sent out circulars. They met in January in Columbus, and they formed the United Mine Workers of America, which was a name they selected and voted on here. And that's what they were doing. They were uniting 2 unions from the same town who had finally decided that they were brother miners and they were fighting for the same cause. And that's one reason that we talk about this being hallowed ground. We say that baby may have that baby was conceived here. They may have just gone to Columbus to deliver it.
Well, we believe the Knights of Labor Hall here in Shawnee to be the first ever labor union hall built in the United States. We haven't been able to find any other evidence of any other labor initiative building their own building prior to that time. It kind of goes along with the history of labor unions here in the United States, because the Knights of Labor formed in 1869 and remained a secret society until 1879, so it was only 2 years after they went public and began admitting that they existed as an organization, that this hall was built. And I see that as being really tied to the confidence of the miners here about their cause and the influence of leaders like Chris Evans to convince them that their cause was so worthy that they ought to build one of the most impressive structures in the valley during that time period.
So we are here at Knights of Labor Miners Memorial Park, and I'm standing behind a sculpture done by the famous Alan Cottrell of Zanesville. This is the Hocking Valley coal miner, and it's a memorial to all the coal miners in the Hocking Valley, past and present. Anyway, you'll notice some triangles, and these triangles represent the Knights of Labor. They were secretive by nature, and so that is why we have the triangles here. And these triangles, you'll notice, are equilateral triangles, representing an egalitarian equilibrium, if you will, of capital, labor, and sort of an idea of an everlasting truth. And one triangle, you'll notice, is the triangle right back here. That is the official seal of the Knights of Labor, and you'll notice there are two fundamental philosophies that are sort of the guiding principles of the Knights of Labor. One being an injury to one is a concern of all, and labor being the first capital. Those were two philosophies that guided the Knights of Labor. They were comprised primarily of folks that made a living with their hands. That is why this area is known as sort of the genesis of the labor movement in the United Mine Workers of America, the most important and influential labor organization of the 20th century.
The situation in New Straitsviile got a little more desperate before the Depression actually happened. And one of those factors was that as machine mining moved in, there was less work for the miners. Whereas you used to have 300 men working in a mine, you might be down to 100, 150 or less. Another factor was obviously World War I. There was an increase in demand, but after the war you dropped back again. Labor struggles that had been sort of diminished, or the strikes because of the wars, started back up in the 20s. And the mine fire itself, as it burned, as they tried to get it out, they tried pumping water down on it and basically filling the mine tunnels up. Instead it turned to steam and sort of pressurized up and burst and sort of cracked some windows downtown in New Straitsviile. Eventually what they were doing is trying to mine ahead of it. I mean, they were paying men to go into the mines and brick off entrances. It would pay them $1 a brick to tie a bandana over their faces and go in and do this, but you couldn't accomplish enough. You couldn't fight it. So it's getting ahead of you. So at that point, they would go to an area where they were mining and mine a little out in front of it, and then they would mine backwards until they ran into the fire again. And at that point, you'd just have to leave. You'd come to an area where the face was starting to get warm. The next day it might be hot. The next day there might be smoke coming out. And at that point you'd backfill some dirt up against that hole and move to another location, hoping that you could mine ahead of it. I've heard of examples in my husband's own family where they did that, where they went to an area where they tried to mine back and they ran into the fire and ignited it again, killing trees in the area. So by the 1920s, the United Mine Workers, which of course got its name in a meeting in New Straitsviile, but they have become more and more powerful and better organized, adding to the amount of states. And the struggle had always been between Ohio laborers being the head of the United Mine Workers, and there were basically just a few states that were fighting for control. When John L. Lewis took over the United Mine Workers, he kept control, and he organized on a bigger level And for the first time, the United Mine Workers is now meeting in hotels and fancier places. His own belief that there were too many mines and too many miners, and the 1925 Jacksonville, Florida agreement basically said that there would be no mines that weren't union. I mean, basically, if you were in the union, everybody at that mine worked and everybody was in the union. That worked well for the new mines, the more automated mines that had the fancier equipment. But back in New Straitsviile, the mines were older, the tunnels were longer, they couldn't afford to put electricity and modern equipment in all of them. So those mines dropped out of the union, and you had less and less union membership each year. Although there were still union mines in New Straitsviile, clear into at least the 40s and 50s. And there's examples of, in Perry County, well up into the 70s, 80s, and beyond. But it gradually diminished. There are no union miners here now. So the power went to the mines that were working in other places, and New Straitsviile was just sort of being forgotten. So the mines went back to being cooperative mines owned by the miners themselves. And you see a lot more mines on the records that are 50 men, 30 men, 20, even 2 or 3. Of course, those were usually a small mine, mostly for the family. But still, there just were almost no big mines around New Straitsviile after that. There were still a few in the Sunday Creek Valley that were large. But so you were set up with basically the Depression had started here 10 years ahead of the Depression in the United States. So we were already in trouble. And that's where Prohibition sort of saved us for a while, because once Prohibition started, we looked at what we were really good at, and a lot of them had been making moonshine for years, and they started. Okay, as the 20s went on and the Depression went on, we had little bits of work. The oil field had helped a little, the brick plants, but everything gradually faded. And then World War II came along, and a lot of our people moved north to work in the factories, to build airplanes and tanks and whatever else might be needed. And then after the war, the GI Bill meant a lot of those people went to school and didn't come back. We lost a lot of our population. And today we still say sometimes that it's reading, writing, arithmetic, and Route 33. The kids that go to college get a job somewhere else. So we've become, there weren't that many employment opportunities for the younger people, but there are some stubborn families that have found ways. They work, they come back, they work in nearby cities. They may work in Columbus or Lancaster or Newark, but they come back. And as the land rebounded, after the mine fires, after the pollution of the streams and the trees were dead, the Wayne National Forest just let the land sit until nature regrouped on its own and brought back the land. Then the environmental groups started changing the laws and going in and taking money and fixing up the streams to where you could fish in them and swim in them again. And so today we see hiking trails and bike paths and forerunner place, four-wheeler trails for people. And we're starting to get more campgrounds. And we're starting to get a development of people who come down here to learn the history, to see the environment, and those are creating opportunities in our town. So for the first time, I'm seeing some hope that some of the younger people are coming back and are staying and trying to figure out ways to make this work again.